Howdy folks, and welcome back to War Thunder with the mighty Jingles. Something slightly different for you today. Instead of just jumping into arcade battles all the time, what I'm doing here is I'm flying some of the single missions that are available for all the various different air forces. Now these missions are unlocked by advancing in rank in a particular air force, so not all of you are going to have this mission available from the start. What I'm doing here is, this is Berlin. Down below me there's a column of T-34-85 tanks, and I'm flying top cover for them in the IL-2 Sturmovik with a flight of other Sturmoviks. Flying on arcade difficulty, obviously, because I'm a noob, but you can redo this on 2 successively higher difficulty settings to earn more credits and more XP. You can even do it cooperatively. You don't have to fly alone. If you've got some friends who want to help you out, then they can take over the other Sturmoviks in your flight. So let's have a look at the actual aircraft itself, the IL-2 Sturmovik. First, it's important to note that the actual proper designation of this thing was the Ilyushin IL-2. Everybody calls it the Sturmovik. It's become known as the Sturmovik, although technically Sturmovik is just the Russian word for ground attack aircraft, so the Su-2 was also a Sturmovik, and so on, and so on, and so on, if we're going to split hairs about it. But to all intents and purposes, if anybody says Sturmovik, this is the aircraft they're thinking of, and by virtue of its popularity and its dominance in the role, effectively Sturmovik now means the Ilyushin 2. And there's a hell of a good reason for that. This thing was a beast. In combination with its successor, the Ilyushin 10, which was essentially the same aircraft just upgraded and modified, the Russians built 42,000 of these things. More of these things have been built than any other aircraft design in all of aviation history. They were absolutely crucial to the Red Army's success on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. So a couple of interesting points to note about the design and development of this thing. It was actually designed by Sergei Ilyushin's team of designers at the Central Design Bureau in 1938. The original concept was for a 2-seat aircraft with an armoured shell that actually weighed 700 kilos, enclosing the crew, the engine, the radiators and the fuel tank. This was a big, heavy aircraft. They had to make some compromises. They eventually rejected the idea of putting 2 crew in order to save some weight. But they made a couple of clever design choices that also helped keep the weight down. The armoured shell of the aircraft comprised anything up to 15-20% of the weight. So instead of just adding to the weight of the existing airframe by putting an armoured shell into it, they built the armoured shell into the load-bearing structure. So all that extra armour was actually also anchoring the fuselage to, the wings and the tailplane and so on and so on. And that saved them a lot of weight. But it wasn't enough. In common with a lot of Soviet aircraft of this time period, yes, Lag 3, I'm looking at you, it was too heavy and it was underpowered. And this is the funny part. The engine that they were going to put into it originally was the Mikulin AM35. This engine was a 1300-ish horsepower engine, but it was designed to give that horsepower at high altitude. It didn't perform well at low altitude. You had to get the thing high in order to develop the greatest power output. Now let's just think about that for a second. Imagine, they're having a design meeting at the Central Design Bureau. All these Soviet designers are sitting around a table, they're smoking their pipes and stroking their beards. They're having a real good strokey beard session, and they're trying to pick which engine to put into their new ground attack aircraft. So comrades, which engine will we put in our new ground attack aircraft? An aircraft which is designed for attacking targets on the ground. And then somebody put their hand up and said, comrades, I've got it. Why don't we use this engine that's designed to develop its greatest power output at high altitude? And not one person around the table saw the obvious flaw in that plan. Seriously? Luckily for the Red Army, and not so luckily for the German Army, at least one person sitting around the table that day was in the position of not being caught bending over on the day the brains were being handed out. And they went ahead and developed a new version of the engine that was actually optimized for low-level operations, which all seems so obvious when you think about it that way. Unfortunately for the designers themselves too, because I'm sure they didn't want to spend the rest of the war shoveling uranium in Siberia. Now, it's probably fairly safe to say that despite the fact that the Sturmovik was an excellent design, its initial combat use was not what we would like to call an unqualified success. In fact, it was pretty disastrous all around. But you kind of have to look at it in the perspective in the context in which it happened. In 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded Russia, the Red Army had less than 300 Sturmoviks in operational use. And they were so new that basically the pilots knew how to take off and land them. They'd never fired the weapons. They didn't know how to use the bombs. They certainly didn't have any tactics for using the things effectively. The ground crews barely had a clue how to maintain, repair, rearm, do anything with them. It was literally just a case of their backs were up against the wall, throw these aircraft into combat, and they suffered accordingly. Less than a month after the start of operations on the 22nd of June 1941, one Sturmovik unit in particular, which had started off with an operational strength of 65 aircraft, was down to 10. But, that's the thing about experience. It's the one thing you need the most when you don't have any of it, and the pilots learned the hard way and they developed successful tactics. Previously, when they were using the armoured versions of the Polikarpov Po-2 ground attack aircraft, the pilots liked to fly at an altitude of about 50 metres and fly pretty much horizontally and shoot into the sides of enemy tanks. This wasn't particularly effective, and it just made you a nice easy target to shoot down as you flew straight and level. So what the pilots instead started to do, despite the fact that the rockets that they were armed with were more than capable of taking out any German armoured fighting vehicle in use at the time in one hit, but they were so notoriously inaccurate that the pilots preferred using the cannons. They were used to the approach that they had been using in previous aircraft, like the Polikarpov 2, of flying at the horizontal approach angle at about 50 metres up. This made them an easy target to shoot down, and the 20mm cannons weren't guaranteed to penetrate the side armour of vehicles like the Panzer III. The top armour of the Panzer III, on the other hand, different matter entirely. So they developed the tactic of flying slightly higher, banking and dropping into a 30-degree dive, where they could put the firepower of these 20mm cannons into the tops of German tanks. And they soon got to be pretty bloody good at it, and that's where this thing started to earn its reputation as a killer of tanks. But just how effective was it really? The Germans certainly respected the thing, and there's probably no greater mark of how useful a weapon system is than how widely it's respected and feared by the people you're using it on. But there's a certain psychological element to, if you're driving a tank and you're being attacked by a ground attack aircraft, there's a certain feeling of helplessness that goes into determining how afraid you are of being attacked by a ground attack aircraft, because basically all you can do is just attempt to dodge and hope he misses you. It's certainly true that the tankers were more afraid of ground aircraft than they needed to be. And it's definitely true that the air forces were overinflating, intentionally or not, the effectiveness of the aircraft that they were using. And I'm not pointing the finger at the Red Army aviation here. Everybody did it. If you look at the figures for Operation for D-Day on the Western Front, and the Hawker Typhoons and Tempests and P-47Ds that were flying ground attack missions over the Western Front, if you added up the number of vehicles that they claimed to have killed, then there were more vehicles killed than the German army actually was fielding in battle at the time. And was this people just padding the books, or were people genuinely making mistakes? They were seeing their shots hit the target and assuming that they killed the targets when actually they weren't. They were near misses, and so on and so on. Easy enough to do. I'm not criticising anybody here. Just trying to get to the root of just how effective was this aircraft. And certainly there were some wildly exaggerated claims made, possibly for propaganda reasons, who can say, about how effective the Sturmovik was. If you look at some of the kill claims made during the Battle of Kursk, for example, 7th of July 1943, 70 tanks from the German 9th Panzer Division were claimed to have been destroyed by Sturmoviks in just 20 minutes. Now, that's interesting, because a week previously the 9th Panzer Division only had a total of 83 tanks and armoured command vehicles available, and they continued in action for over 3 months afterwards, with most of its initial tanks still intact. Another Soviet report of the action on the same day reported that, I quote, "Ground forces highly valued the work of aviation on the battlefield. In a number of instances, enemy attacks were thwarted thanks to our air operations. Thus, on the 7th of July, enemy tank attacks were disrupted in the Kashara region. Here, our assault aircraft delivered 3 powerful attacks in groups of 20 to 30, which resulted in the destruction and disabling of 34 tanks. The enemy was forced to halt further attacks and to withdraw the remnants of his force north of Kashara." Okay. Further claims during the Battle of Kursk suggest that the Sturmoviks destroyed over 270 tanks and several thousand men in a period of just 2 hours against the 3rd Panzer Division. But on the 1st of July, before the start of the operation, the 3rd Panzer Division only had 90 tanks and armoured command vehicles. It's 180 less than the Russians claimed they destroyed by the Sturmoviks. And on the 11th of July, a week later, they still had 41 operational tanks. Another one, and the Russians again claimed that in a period of 4 hours, Sturmoviks destroyed 240 tanks of the 17th Panzer Division and virtually wiped them out. Well, that's funny, because on the 1st of July, the 17th Panzer Division only had 67 tanks. That's 173 less than the Russians claimed they destroyed by the Sturmoviks. To add insult to injury, the division didn't even take part in the battle. It was in the Army Group South Reserve. So what's going on here? Were the Russians just lying about how effective these aircraft were? Or in the heat of battle, were they mistaking one unit for another? Was the intelligence on the units that they were facing faulty? Yeah, it's probably a combination of both. I've no doubt that the Russians were, for propaganda purposes, inflating the success of their aircraft. But I've no doubt that they also thought they were doing better than they were actually doing, due to honest mistakes. It's difficult to get effective after-action intelligence, and particularly in a battle like the Battle of Kursk, when the front line's moving backwards and forwards so rapidly. And I've no doubt that they were operating off faulty intelligence in the first place, and they weren't entirely certain which German units were in front of them. And so probably a combination of all three different things. But there is no doubt whatsoever that the Sturmovik was entirely capable of killing any armoured vehicle that the Germans could put against them. And it's interesting to note that the Sturmoviks were actually technically inferior to ground attack aircraft like the Hawker Tempest and the Hawker Typhoon and the P-47D Thunderbolt. The Sturmoviks had a much more puny bomb load. They usually carried 50 kilo, very rarely 100 kilo bombs, compared to the 1,000-pound bombs that the P-47 routinely carried. They didn't have as powerful a cannon armament as the Hawker Tempest and the Hawker Typhoon, but it's the way the Russians employed them. Typically, the Western Allies would have pairs at the most of ground attack aircraft, literally just flying what they called rodeos around a large target area and just jumping on targets of opportunity, or being available at short notice to divert and go for targets that were radioed into them. The Russians didn't go for any of that shit. They would put 20 or 30 of these things up in the air at once and go looking for targets. And so, it was definitely a case of victory through superior firepower, the good old-fashioned Russian way. Quantity, as Stalin is very famous for having said, has a quality all of its own. And it's kind of like the story that I heard from the days of the space race in the 60s and the 70s. And it's almost certainly not a true story, but, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And the story goes that the NASA were looking for a design of a pen that would work in microgravity. So the Parker Corporation, very famous pen manufacturer, Parker Pens, spent millions trying to... They work with all sorts of different designs, pens that use micro pumps to pump the ink to the nib and so on and so on and so on. And eventually, however many millions of dollars they'd spent in research, they eventually came up with a pen that worked flawlessly in zero gravity. The Russians just used pencils. Now, it doesn't matter if the story's true or not. It's a perfect example of the two different design approaches employed by two allies, both working at different ends of the spectrum. And the Russians were very, very much of the opinion that if you just threw enough quantity at something, the problem would go away. Whereas the Americans have always been accused of, if you just throw enough money at the problem will go away. And so you end up with two very, very different aircraft, like the Sturmovik and the P-47D. Both very, very different in their design approach, but both very, very capable and just getting the job done. So that was the History Channel with the mighty Jingles. Hope we kept you entertained there with the development, design history and operational use of the IL-2 Sturmovik, and back to the mission. And one thing that I did wonder when I was flying this mission, going back to when I was talking about the operational effectiveness of the aircraft, when they were first getting in grips with how this aircraft performed, and they were trying to use the same tactics that they'd used when they were flying the PO2s, flying in horizontally at a 50-metre altitude and just not being able to penetrate the side armour of German medium and heavy tanks, and learning to put the thing into a 30-degree dive and use those 20mm cannons to hammer the relatively thin top armour of German tanks. It just makes you wonder, how far has this been modelled in the game? And it's not something I've actually tried, and I'm probably going to have to. Is it actually more effective to shoot into the top of tanks? How far have they gone with modelling the armour of tanks in the game? And it's interesting to think about that, because they're, as you know, War Thunder is going to be Army, Navy and Air Force. At some point in the future of this game, you're going to have to be using ground attack aircraft against tanks driven by other players. So there's that. Oh, hello. Here we are at Berlin Municipal Football Stadium, and it looks like some German fans are conducting a pitch invasion. We're going to have to do something about that. That was a good shot. Good shot with a rocket there. One shot, direct hit, German heavy tank. Tiger 2s and Panthers modelled in this mission. Tiger 2s, you need the rocket to take them out. The Panthers you can kill with cannons, but obviously you get a hit with a rocket and it's good night Vienna. Anti-aircraft gun over there. Alright, let's take... Now screw that. While we've still got rockets, let's use them. That one dropped. There you go, another direct hit. 4 rockets left. How many tanks? 4 rockets left, 3 tanks. Can I do it, or am I going to suck? Yeah, I think we all know the answer to that question. Come on, baby. Oh, another one. Yep, got him. 1 rocket left, 2 tanks. No, 2 rockets left. 2 tanks. It's doable, it's doable. Not if I fire them like that, it ain't. Gonna have to wait for a reload. Well, let's see what we can do with this last rocket. And then it's down to cannons. Heavy tank. Come on, come on, come on. Boom! Direct hit. Right. Last tank left is a medium, and if I use these cannons properly, I can kill him just with the cannons. I won't have to sit around waiting for a rocket reload. And there's one thing that I feel compelled that I must mention about this map. Look at that. That has got to be one of the worst designs of a football stadium I have ever seen. Look at how far away the stands are from the pitch. You can't see what's going on. And the refreshment area is miles away from the stand. Half time would be over before you got back to your seat with your pie and cup of tea. Oh, tell you what, the Germans, they might know a thing or two about tanks and aircraft, but they don't know a thing about building football stadiums. Almost as little as I know about taking out medium tanks with 20mm guns and the Sturmovik. That really sucked. Oh, AI Wingman took him out. Well, they are useful for something. There's always that. And now the Moscow Dynamo fans are conducting their own pitch invasion. They think it's all over. It is now. While we're waiting for the mission to end, let's just rack up a cheeky anti-aircraft gun kill, because, why not? So, successful mission. Let's have a look and see what we got out of it. So, 4,500 credits and 18,000 XP. And it's not great, but bear in mind that I'm playing them on arcade difficulty. There are 2 more realistic difficulty settings that you can play it on, and you can replay them on a higher difficulty setting each time and get credits and XP each time you do it on a new difficulty setting. More credits and more XP, substantially more than the pitiful 4,500 credits I earned there. So there's that to add a little bit of longevity to it. But the point of these missions isn't for farming credits and XP. It's an alternative game mode to just jumping into random battles all the time, whether that be historical battles, full real battles, arcade battles, whatever. This is a little sideshow that you can explore at your leisure, and there's no downside to doing it because you're not flying your own aircraft. You will never pay a repair bill for flying an aircraft in a single mission, and in a lot of cases it is actually going to allow you to test fly aircraft that you don't already have access to. For example, in the some of the American missions on the Western Front, you get the opportunity to fly a P-51D Mustang long before you reach rank 13 in the US Air Force and are capable of actually unlocking and flying the thing for yourself. And there's no downside to it because you can wreck any number of them. In the mission I was flying in the Sturmovik there were 4 aircraft in the flight, and every time, if I managed to get myself shot down, I would just jump into one of the AI-controlled aircraft of my wingmen and take over that. So you could get shot down 4 times in that mission and not pay a single credit in repair bills for your own Sturmovik, if you even owned a Sturmovik. So there's that. It's just a little alternative, single missions, another option for you to explore instead of the usual grind, just jumping into arcade battles over and over and over. And it's not without its benefits. You can only make money and XP by doing this. So a little alternative for you there. Hope you enjoyed the history lesson. Hope you enjoyed the video. As always, watch your 6, and I'll catch you next time.